Hello, I'm Kel Tremaine. Welcome to this lecture on individual difference and assessment. In previous lectures, you would have heard about the various theories of intelligence and personality. You might also have heard a little about the assessment of personality and intelligence. So this lecture is going to go into more detail about the underlying assumptions and concepts around assessment, measurement, and testing of individual differences. You'll notice that this lecture brings together information across the different chapters of your text on personality and intelligence. So keep that in mind when you're reviewing the text. At the end of this lecture, you'll become familiar with what assessment is and how we measure individual differences. From this, you should be able to recall and understand some important concepts that underpin assessment and measurement practices. Secondly, we'll turn to looking specifically at personality assessment and why we would bother to measure personality to begin with. How we go about doing that and what tests we commonly use. You should be able to demonstrate some basic knowledge of different personality tests and why we might use them after that segment of the lecture. 3. In covering intelligence tests and assessment practices, you should gain some knowledge of standardization and also what some commonly used tests do and what they measure, as well as an important understanding of the context in which intelligence testing and the controversies around it has developed. 4. As with much of what we've been covering in this unit, we will look at the social and cultural contexts that surround assessment of psychological variables such as personality and intelligence. From this, you should be able to critically assess the validity and relevance of assessment practices for different people. This will hopefully emphasize the importance of understanding the person in context, as well as understanding assessment practices in context. To get a better understanding of what assessment involves and what we do to try and develop the best assessments for measuring individual differences, there are a number of concepts that are important to know. The emphasis that you should get from all this is that there are some fundamental and basic assumptions and procedures that are embedded within assessment practices. Knowing these will help you to better understand how we develop assessments, including how we develop ways to assess you in this unit, for example. Although the discussion in this lecture focuses on personality and intelligence as psychological constructs, many of the ideas can also be applied to the kinds of assessments we use to evaluate your learning within this unit. The general notion of assessment is, of course, evaluation. Keep that in mind because inherent in the concept of evaluation is the notion of value. It's rare that an assessment is done simply for descriptive purposes. Otherwise, why would we bother conducting assessments at all? Typically, we conduct assessments because they have some purpose. For example, as feedback for improvement, as in performance assessments or product assessments, to determine whether someone should progress or not, as in educational assessment, to determine suitability, as in vocational or human resource assessments, or to determine what needs to be done, as in a safety assessment. Throughout your degree, for example, in every unit that you're going to be doing, you will be assessed to evaluate what you have learnt, with an expectation that you should have learnt something that your teachers have determined is valuable, and this has an impact on your progression through the degree. So what is psychological assessment? Similarly, psychological assessments are used to evaluate, in this case, their specified procedures used to evaluate abilities, behaviours, and personal qualities. Usually this is through asking people questions and asking them to complete particular tasks. Importantly, we often refer to this process as a measure of individual difference because we're measuring individual differences. And what we're really looking at is variation between individuals and how an individual differs from other people. In personality, this almost seems like common sense, doesn't it? We're all different from each other. So the tools we use are to try and understand how we're different and also how we are similar to each group and the rest of the group, or to each other and the rest of the group. Although there are many different areas of assessment in psychology, such as assessment of skills, learning, achievement, memory, mental health, when we talk about individual differences, we're often talking about two main areas: personality and intelligence. Why might this be, do you think? One reason might be that there's an underlying assumption that the source of the individual differences in personality and intelligence are stable. That is, that there's not a great deal of change over time or across situations. And hopefully you'll notice, as we talk about these areas, that this makes an important difference to how we assess and the kinds of criticisms that have been levelled at assessment practices, especially in the area of intelligence. What we need to be mindful of, therefore, is that the way in which we develop and conduct assessments is obviously going to be influenced by the definitions and theories that we have. If my definition of learning is that it's the same as memory, then the questions I choose for the exam are likely to be all factual recall questions, and I might do things like ask you on what page the definition of psychological assessment is presented. So how many of you have just turned to the page? Unfortunately, or fortunately, that's not the definition that I or others in the psychology school subscribe to. If, on the other hand, my definition of learning in this unit includes your ability to recall information, so memory, to understand it, and also apply it to novel situations, then chances are that some of the questions in the exam might include case studies. For example, giving you a case of a person demonstrating some personal qualities and asking you what personality dimension they're most likely to score high on. Hopefully from this you can see how our definitions and theories, influenced by our context and worldviews, will influence how we measure and assess psychological quality. In psychological assessment, we need to differentiate formal and informal assessment practices. We of course can conduct an interview so that we can find out more information from someone about, for example, their mental health status. So I might ask them about their background, what kinds of difficulties they've been experiencing, and how they've been feeling. However, there may also be a need for more formal kinds of assessments. For example, in order to actually use the medical and psychiatric terminology to diagnose someone with what we call depression and to evaluate the severity of that, there are specific symptoms that a person experiences. And we might need a more formal, systematic set of procedures to determine how severe a depressive episode is, rather than just taking a best guess. Now, there are important components of this definition. Systematic implies that we're consistent and thorough in our assessments to try and get the best measure of functioning. The best measure of functioning, of aptitudes, of abilities, and of mental states. So at the end of semester, for example, I'm going to decide who will pass or fail on the basis of, say, 5 questions taken from across all the lectures, tutorials, and textbook. Now, if I was in a lecture right now, I'd probably hear the groans of discontent. This was just a little example though. Obviously, for a formal assessment, we need to put the assessment through some rigorous tests itself to see whether it's doing the job it's actually meant to do. In other words, we need to assess the assessment or test the test. And we do this through 3 major ways. Through ensuring that it's reliable, ensuring that it's valid, and that it's standardized. And I'll go through these in more detail now. Developing a good instrument is a difficult task that's long and labor intensive. And it's dependent on a thorough and conceptual understanding of what you're trying to measure. You then have to write questions or statements that become items, and they're assumed to be indicators of the construct you're trying to measure. These items are then tried out on a sample of respondents. Poor items that are not working as intended are deleted, while others may need to be reworded and refined to better understand, to be better understood by the respondents and be a better indicator or be better indicators of the construct. This new set is then tried out on a new sample, and so on, until and the process continues until one has the shortest and best possible set of items to measure that particular construct that they're measuring. Now, fortunately, researchers don't have to develop instruments themselves. Rather, they choose from existing measures that have been developed by others. Whether they develop a measure on their own or use an existing one, it's absolutely imperative that the measure is reliable and valid. Otherwise, it's going to be quite useless as a measure of the construct or the latent variable that you're looking at. Let's, for the sake of argument, say that I weigh 69 kilos and that I've just brought a brand new set of bathroom scales that were on the cheap at a $2 shop. And then when I step on them, I find out that I weigh 70 kilos. You'd probably be happy with that. Or I find out that I weigh 70 kilos, so I'd probably be happy with that. And because I'm excited, 5 minutes later I hop on again. And for some reason I'm measuring 85 kilos. And you think to yourself, hey, that can't be right. And then 5 minutes later you jump on it again and it's measuring 61 kilos. This weighing machine would, if it was my weighing machine, it'd be going straight back to the shop. Why? Because it's being unreliable. My weight's not going to change that much in such a short space of time. So even if one of those measures are correct, the scales are not measuring my weight consistently. And so you take the scales back to the shop and you exchange them. But this time, you hop on the scales when you get home, you hop on and it says 8 kilos. Then you hop on them again and it says 8 kilos again. And then you hop on it again and it's saying 8 again. The scales are certainly reliable because what they're actually measuring, they're measuring consistently. But they're not valid, as they're not a measure of your weight for you. It turns out that there was a mistake at the factory when I take the scales back. In actual fact, they're measuring my foot size. So it's clear that these scales are a heap of junk for measuring weight. In the same way, when you take psychological tests, those tests must be reliable and valid. But this can be difficult to do. The concept of reliability is really about, if you complete an assessment, how stable or consistent are the outcomes. How stable or consistent are the scores? For example, if we're trying to assess your essay writing skills and your ability to form an argument in psychology, then essays as a form of assessment in psychology are reliable to the extent that the scores you get on writing an argument style essay are consistent each time you write one. And it shouldn't matter what the topic is, as long as you use the same skills each time. That is, if argument-based essay writing skills in psychology are what we're measuring. These skills might be different from exam skills, which rely on you learning content in a different way and recalling it under time pressure situations. So for this reason, some of you might have already discovered that you score consistently well in essays but not in exams, or vice versa. Now, the above example assumes that, just as in psychological assessment, the actual thing or construct we're measuring is stable. If I actually believed that essay writing skills were unchangeable, then we wouldn't bother teaching them in class. So as you may recall, a fundamental assumption of both intelligence and personality is that they're fairly stable over time, space, and observable to different people. In fact, for personality, these qualities are inherent in the definition of personality, for example. There's an expectation that a person's shyness is most likely to be the same over the course of his or her lifetime, and it will be noticeable across different situations, and different people will typically observe that similar quality. So when we're talking about reliability, we're talking about this notion of consistency in measurement. Reliability in this technical sense is not altogether different from reliability in its everyday meaning. For example, one of my 3 little ones put a bunch of marbles in the drain the other day and blocked up the drain, and I contacted a plumber who said they'd be there at 11 a.m, but they ended up arriving at 3 p.m. So in this case, a plumber was unreliable. An unreliable measure may sometimes work, just as an unreliable plumber may sometimes arrive and work. But we can never actually predict when either will perform adequately. Now, there are a number of ways we can test whether an assessment is stable over time, space, and different assessment forms. These are test-retest reliability, parallel forms of reliability, internal consistency and split-half reliability, and inter-rater reliability. I'll go through each of these briefly now. Test-retest reliability is about stability and consistency over time. For example, if I was to talk about personality, if we expect that a person's shyness, let's call this introversion, is a stable personality trait, then the personality test for introversion that we give at time 1, say when the person is 22, and then the same test given at, say, time 2, at, say, when the person's age 23, should yield similar scores. In other words, if you score high on extroversion at one time, then you should score high on extroversion at other times when you complete the test. If you score low on extroversion at one time, then you should score low on extroversion at other times when you complete the test. This is known as high test-retest reliability. Now I can already anticipate that some of you are saying, I was more or less extroverted when I was younger, and I've changed. That's of course likely. There is of course likely to be some individual difference, even in terms of the stability of individual differences. But typically, we would expect that the variation would not be large. I think very few of you would say that you were very introverted when you were younger and now you're super extroverted. We measure reliability in this setting by calculating what's called a correlation. We won't need to go into any statistics on that, but suffice to say that what we would do is get a large group of people, such as everyone in this class, to complete an extroversion test twice. What we expect for high reliability is that the people who scored high on extroversion in time 1 would also score high on extroversion in time 2. People who score low on extroversion, that is, they're more introverted, at time 1 are also more likely to score low on extroversion, or in other words, be introverted, in time 2. Correlations, they range between 0 and 1, or positive correlations do. Correlations of 0 mean that there's no correlation at all. That is, there's no reliability such that they're random as to whether they're high or low on extroversion or introversion at time 1 and time 2. If there is a correlation of 1, then this means that all of you get exactly the same score at time 1 as you would in time period 2. Obviously, that's very improbable, but we're aiming towards that end of correlation range for high test-retest reliability. A negative correlation may mean that those people who score high at time period 1 then score low at time period 2, and vice versa. Now, if I was to look at intelligence and assume that intelligence is a relatively stable trait, and most psychologists do agree that it is, then scores on our measure would be stable or consistent over time. And research suggests that correlations between IQ at age 9 and at age 40 are in the 0.7 to 0.8 range, which indicates a high degree of stability. So if you're a smart kid, then you're more likely to be a smart adult. Why are test-retest scores important? Well, it's not just because our definitions imply that they should be. If we measure cognitive functioning, as we often do through intelligence-style tests, and the scores for people are similar over time, that is, there's high test-retest reliability, then we can detect the impact of medical problems, such as brain injuries, over time on cognitive functioning. For example, if they're worsening or improving. In parallel forms, the different versions of the same test should produce similar outcomes. So rather than do a test-retest by giving the test more than once, the person completes an alternative version or a parallel form of the test. This is beneficial because sometimes a person taking the test might remember their response to the items from when they completed the test previously. For example, if we gave someone the actual examination paper for this subject at the end of semester and the deferred exam paper also, they should have similar scores. Otherwise, they're not parallel forms of reliability. The parallel forms approach is very similar to the split half reliability described shortly. The major difference is that parallel forms are constructed so that the two forms of the tests can be used independently of each other and are considered equivalent measures. For example, as I said before, the on-time exam and also the deferred exam for this semester would be examples of parallel forms of reliability. Internal consistency refers to the extent to which items in a measuring instrument or a scale are all measuring the same thing. It requires only one administration of the instrument. So internal consistency is really about whether different items within a given test that are meant to be measuring the same concept yield similar results. For example, when measuring intelligence, if our theory and definition includes a general component of intelligence, then we typically expect people with a high IQ to get high scores across the different and specific aspects of the intelligence test, which is what is suggested by research on standard commonly used intelligence assessments. For example, the Wechsler subtest is internally consistent. All of its items are measuring the same skill, as evidenced by high correlations among the items. The individual items within the Wechsler subtest do correlate substantially with one another. When it comes to personality, if you think about the five-factor model of Ocean, the theory implies that people will vary across the different dimensions. So in this case, internal consistency is about whether a person answers consistently to the items or questions that measure, say, extroversion, such that each of his or her responses are, say, low on extroversion and therefore show that he or she is more introverted. One way of measuring internal consistency is to split the test in half, which is, funnily enough, why we call it split half. In split half reliability, we typically randomly divide all items that purport to measure the same construct into two sets. We administer the entire instrument to a sample of people and calculate the total score for each randomly divided half, the split half reliability estimate. For example, let's say we wanted to measure the split half reliability of an intelligence questionnaire that had only, say, 6 items. Highly unlikely, but let's say this is just an example. First, we would calculate the score for the even numbered items. That's 2, 4 and 6. And then calculate the score for the odd numbered items, which is 1, 3 and 5. The split half reliability estimate, as shown in the figure, is simply the correlation between these two total scores. In the example, it's 0.87. Let's say we do this for the end of semester examination. Why wouldn't we just split the first half from the second half? That's a bit of a question for you. Why wouldn't you just take the first half of the exam and split it from the second half? The main reason here is because you might be more fatigued in the second half, so your results to the second half may be a bit lower than the first half. That's typically why we would choose odd items or randomized items and compare the two halves. Inter-rater reliability is another type of reliability. Inter-rater reliability refers to the consistency of measurement when different people observe the same event or score on the same test. So imagine that you're a psychologist and you're examining bullying in the schoolyard. You decide to sit down and count the number of acts of bullying that occur in lunchtime. You have a similarly trained colleague who's sitting on the other side of the schoolyard observing the same kids, who is also counting the number of acts of bullying. So what we have are two people independently scoring their observations, and the closer their scores are, the higher the inter-rater reliability. What's important here is to have a very specific and explicit scoring instructions and similarly trained professionals that use it in the same way. Inter-rater reliability is not mentioned very often in intelligence testing, but it is commonly described in personality testing. In a study of extroversion, for example, one way to assess inter-rater reliability would be to ask two different teachers who knew the same children to rate them and see whether their ratings were similar. In this case, because personality should really be demonstrated in part through a person's behaviour, there is an expectation that if person A can identify that you appear extroverted across a range of situations, then person B should as well. Alternatively, if you complete a self-report measure of personality and score highly on, say, neuroticism, then a person who's rating you on characteristics representative of neuroticism should also score you highly. If this happens, then we say that there's a high inter-rater or inter-observer reliability. So to use a plumber analogy again, the plumber establishes test-retest reliability by showing up when he or she says they'll show up across repeated occasions, and then he does actually show up on each job and does the job competently. The plumber establishes internal consistency because he's able to not only to fix the toilet with as much dispatch as he would the hot water heater or the leaky pipe, he can also boast inter-rater reliability. As I got his contact from a friend who had used him, and I agree in his assessment of his work in the same way or in the same manner as my friend who used him. So we both think he's a good plumber. If the plumber fails in any of these reliability tests, he's unlikely to be called again, just as an unreliable measure of personality or intelligence is unlikely to be used in another study.